When widower Samuel Hartwell spent his last $20 on 3 abandoned children with burlap sacks covering their heads, he thought he was simply giving them a chance at a new life in 1867 Kansas. But when the eldest child whispered their family name, Chamberlain Samuel realized he'd just adopted the children of the territory's most notorious outlaw, and now faced an impossible choice. Would he protect them from a world that saw only their father's sins, or abandon them like everyone else had? The orphanage door slammed shut behind Samuel Hartwell with a sound that made his bones shake. 3 small figures sat huddled in the corner like broken dolls, their heads covered completely by rough burlap sacks that rose and fell with each careful breath. The smell of old wood and unwashed bodies filled the cramped room. Mixing with something else, Samuel couldn't name the bitter scent of dreams that had died too young. "Those 3 came in a week ago," said Mrs. Fletcher, the orphanage keeper, pointing one bony finger toward the children. Her voice sounded like chalk scraping against stone. "Won't eat much. Won't talk to nobody. The family that brought them here said they were trouble." Samuel's chest felt tight as he watched the smallest child, barely bigger than a feed sack, shift closer to the others. Something about their silence reminded him of his own empty house, where even his footsteps sounded lonely. The autumn wind of 1867 rattled the windows of the building, sending dust dancing through the pale sunlight. Outside, the town of Millbrook, Kansas, stretched along the railroad tracks like a promise that hadn't quite come true yet. Samuel had watched the trains come and go for 2 years now, ever since his wife Margaret had died of the fever. Each whistle blast reminded him of places he'd never see, adventures he'd never have. But today felt different somehow, like standing at the edge of a cliff before jumping into deep water. "Why do they wear those sacks?" Samuel asked, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The children's heads turned toward him at the sound, like flowers following the sun. Mrs. Fletcher's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile on a kinder face. "Shame," she said, spitting the word out like it tasted bad. "Their daddy's doings mark them good. Better if folks don't see their faces. Don't start asking questions they don't want answered." Samuel felt his hands curl into fists without meaning to. He knew what it felt like to carry weight that wasn't entirely yours, the way people looked at him after Margaret died. Like grief was something that might spread if you got too close. The middle child moved slightly, and Samuel caught a glimpse of small fingers poking through a hole in the burlap. The fingers were clean but thin, like twigs that might snap in a strong wind. Something twisted in Samuel's stomach as he realized these weren't just children, they were prisoners, locked away not by bars but by fear and shame. "How much?" The words left Samuel's mouth before he could stop them. Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her gray hair. "For all 3? She looked him up and down like she was measuring him for a coffin. $20. That's barely enough to cover what they've eaten. But I suppose it's better than keeping them here till they're old enough to work." Samuel's hand moved to his pocket, where his last $20 sat folded and worn from too much handling. It was supposed to buy seed for next spring's planting, or maybe fix the leak in his roof before winter came. But as he watched the children sit so still they barely seemed alive, Samuel made a choice that would change everything. "I'll take them," he said, pulling out the money before he could change his mind. The bills felt heavier than they should have, like they carried the weight of 3 lives instead of just paper and ink. Mrs. Fletcher snatched the money faster than a cat grabbing a mouse. "What you do with them after they leave here ain't my concern," she said, already turning away. "But don't come crying to me if you bite off more than you can chew." Samuel barely heard her words because something miraculous was happening. The smallest child had lifted her head slightly, and, through a gap in the burlap, he caught sight of one bright blue eye, watching him with careful hope. The walk from the orphanage to his wagon felt like crossing a frozen pond in spring. Each step might be the one that sent everything crashing down. The children followed him without a word, their bare feet making soft whispers against the dusty ground. Samuel found himself walking slower than usual, trying to think of something to say that might bridge the enormous space between them. "My name is Samuel," he said finally, his voice sounding strange in the afternoon air. The children kept walking, but he noticed the middle one's head tilt slightly, like a bird listening for danger. "I live about 2 miles from here. It's not much of a place, but..." He stopped talking because he didn't know how to finish the sentence. What could he promise them? That life would be better? That people would be kind? That the world wouldn't judge them for things they'd never done? Behind them, he could see curtains twitching in windows as people watched their strange parade. Mrs. Morrison stood in the doorway of her general store, her arms crossed and her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Samuel had known Helena Morrison since they were children, had danced at her wedding before the war took her husband away. But now she looked at him like he'd lost what little sense God had given him. The oldest child stumbled slightly, and Samuel reached out without thinking to steady him. The boy flinched away from his touch like he'd been burned, but not before Samuel felt how thin his arm was under the rough cloth of his shirt. These children hadn't just been abandoned, they'd been forgotten, left to waste away like plants without water or sunlight. "It's all right," Samuel said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the boy or himself. "Nobody's going to hurt you now." The words felt big and scary in his mouth, like promises he might not be able to keep. But as they reached his wagon and he helped the children climb into the back, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 long years. Purpose. The ride home passed in silence except for the creaking of wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of his old horse, Jasper. Samuel found himself glancing back at the children every few minutes, making sure they were still there, still real. They sat close together like they were trying to become one person, the oldest with his arms around the other two. As his small cabin came into view, Samuel felt his heart start beating faster. The place looked different somehow, seeing it through their eyes, the sagging front porch, the garden gone to weeds, the windows that hadn't been properly cleaned since Margaret died. It wasn't much, but it was home. Or at least, it could be. "Here we are," he said as he pulled the wagon to a stop. The children climbed down carefully, like they were walking on ice. Samuel watched them look around at his property, the chicken coop that needed new wire, the well with its squeaky handle, the old oak tree where he'd planned to build a swing someday. Everything looked shabby and worn, but maybe that was fitting. Maybe broken things belonged together. The inside of Samuel's cabin felt smaller with 4 people in it instead of 1. The children stood near the door like they were ready to run, their covered heads turning this way and that as they took in the simple furniture, the cold fireplace, the kitchen table where Samuel ate his lonely meals. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sunlight, streaming through windows that Margaret used to keep sparkling clean. "You can sit down if you want," Samuel offered, gesturing toward the chairs around his table. The children looked at each other, or at least, their covered heads turned toward each other in what might have been silent conversation. Slowly, carefully, they made their way to the table and perched on the edges of chairs like birds ready to take flight. Samuel busied himself at the stove, grateful to have something to do with his hands. The simple task of building a fire and heating water felt normal, ordinary, like maybe he hadn't just changed his entire life in the space of an afternoon. But as he worked, he could feel 3 pairs of eyes watching his every move through the rough weave of burlap sacks. "Are you hungry?" he asked over his shoulder. The smallest child's head bobbed up and down, the first real response he'd gotten from any of them. Samuel smiled, though they couldn't see it. "Good. I've got some stew left from yesterday, and I can make biscuits if you'd like." The mention of food seemed to relax them slightly, and Samuel heard what might have been a quiet sigh of relief. As he stirred the pot of stew, Samuel tried to imagine what these children had been through. How long had they been wearing those sacks? How many people had looked at them with fear or disgust? How many times had they been told they were unwanted, unwelcome, unsafe to be around? The questions made his chest ache in a way that reminded him of losing Margaret, that same helpless anger at a world that seemed designed to hurt innocent people. "My wife used to make the best biscuits in 3 counties, Samuel said, mostly to fill the silence. "I never learned her secret, but I do my best." He glanced back at the children and caught sight of the middle one's hands resting on the table. They were small hands, pale and clean despite everything, with fingernails bitten down to the quick, nervous hands, worried hands, hands that belonged to someone far too young to carry such heavy burdens. The smell of warming stew began to fill the cabin, rich and comforting. Samuel heard one of the children's stomachs growl loudly, followed by what sounded like a muffled giggle from the smallest one. The sound made Samuel's heart skip. When was the last time he'd heard laughter in this house? "Almost ready," he said, ladling the stew into 4 bowls. Steam rose from each serving like little prayers, and Samuel found himself hoping this simple meal might be the beginning of something good. He set the bowls on the table along with spoons, then sat down across from the children. They stared at their food through the burlap, and Samuel realized the problem immediately. "Oh," he said, feeling foolish. "You can't very well eat with those things on your heads, can you?" The children went very still, like rabbits sensing a hawk overhead. Samuel could practically feel their fear radiating across the table like heat from a fire. "It's all right," he said gently. "There's nobody here but us. Nobody to see, nobody to judge." The oldest child's hands crept up toward the edge of his sack, then stopped. Samuel could hear the boy's breathing getting faster, shallow, and scared. "What if?" The middle child spoke for the first time, his voice muffled but clear. "What if you don't like what you see?" The question hit Samuel like a punch to the stomach. How many times had he wondered the same thing? How many mornings had he avoided looking in the mirror, afraid of seeing the broken man staring back? "Then that would be my failing, not yours," Samuel said, and meant it. "But I don't think that's going to happen." One by one, the sacks came off. The oldest was a boy with sandy brown hair that stuck up in all directions and green eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. The middle child was also a boy, smaller but with the same intelligent gaze and a face full of freckles that made Samuel think of stars scattered across a night sky. The youngest was a girl with dark hair that had been braided once but was now falling loose around her shoulders, and blue eyes bright with curiosity instead of fear. They were beautiful children. Not perfect. The oldest had a small scar on his chin. The middle boy was thin enough that Samuel could see the shape of his bones beneath his skin, and the little girl had a tooth missing from her smile. But they were real, human, normal children, who deserved love and safety and full bellies. "What are your names?" Samuel asked, his voice steadier now that he could see their faces. The boys looked at each other, then at their sister, some wordless conversation passing between them. Finally, the oldest spoke. "I'm David," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is Matthew, and that's Elizabeth." Samuel nodded, filing the names away in his memory, like precious treasures. David, Matthew, Elizabeth. His children now, whether the law said so or not. "And your family name?" Samuel asked, though part of him wondered if he really wanted to know. The children exchanged another look, this one filled with something that looked like shame and fear mixed together. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, struggling to form words that might change everything. The silence stretched on like a held breath, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the tick of the old clock on the mantelpiece. Outside, Samuel could hear the wind picking up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. A storm was coming, he could smell it in the air, that sharp scent that meant rain and lightning and change. Finally, David found his voice. It came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the quiet cabin, the words rang out like church bells. "Chamberlain. Our name is Chamberlain." The spoon fell from Samuel's hand and clattered against his bowl with a sound like breaking glass. The name hit him like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd tried to forget. Newspaper headlines, wanted posters, whispered conversations that stopped when he walked into a room. Marcus Chamberlain, the outlaw whose gang had terrorized Kansas and Missouri for 3 bloody years. Marcus Chamberlain, who had robbed banks and trains and killed 2 men in the process. Marcus Chamberlain, who had been gunned down by a sheriff's posse just outside of Lawrence, leaving behind a wife and 3 children who had vanished into the shame of his legacy. Samuel stared at the children as children and saw not the spawn of a criminal but 3 small souls carrying burdens they'd never chosen. David was watching him with eyes that expected rejection, ready to gather his siblings and flee back into whatever darkness they'd come from. Matthew had gone perfectly still, like a deer sensing danger. Elizabeth looked confused, too young to fully understand why her father's name carried such weight. "Your father," Samuel began, then stopped. What could he say? That Marcus Chamberlain had robbed the very bank where Samuel kept his meager savings? That the man's actions had left widows and orphans in his wake? That his name had become a curse word in decent homes across the territory? But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, Samuel remembered something else, a detail from the newspaper stories that had always bothered him. "I remember reading that he sent money," Samuel said slowly, carefully, "to the families of the men who died. Not much, but something. David's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to shed, and Samuel saw the boy he really was beneath all that careful control, a child, trying to make sense of a father who had been both protector and destroyer. "Mama said he wasn't always bad," David whispered. "Said something broke inside him after the war, after he saw too much dying and couldn't find his way back to being good." The words carried a weight that made Samuel's chest tight. How many men had come back from that terrible conflict changed, damaged, unable to fit back into the lives they'd left behind? Samuel looked at these three children: David with his quiet strength, Matthew with his watchful intelligence, Elizabeth with her innocent hope, and made the second life-changing decision of his day. Whatever their father had done, whatever sins he'd committed, these children were not him. They were themselves, precious and worthy and deserving of love. "Well then," Samuel said, picking up his spoon and taking a deliberate bite of stew, "I guess we'd better eat before this gets cold." Elizabeth screamed in the middle of the night, a sound that tore through Samuel's dreams like a knife through cloth. He bolted upright in his bed, heart hammering against his ribs as her cries echoed through the small cabin. By the time he stumbled to the children's room, David was already holding his sister, rocking her back and forth, while Matthew sat wide-eyed on his makeshift bed of quilts and old lumber. "Shh, Lizzie, it's all right," David whispered, but his own voice shook with leftover fear. It was just the dream again. Samuel stood in the doorway, unsure whether to enter or retreat. These children had been in his home for 3 days now, and each night brought the same terrors, memories of their father's violent end, visions of angry crowds, nightmares of being forever hunted. "The bad men were coming again," Elizabeth sobbed against her brother's shoulder. "They had guns and mean faces, and they wanted to hurt us because of Papa." Samuel's throat tightened as he watched David stroke his sister's hair with the practiced movements of someone who'd done this too many times before. How long had this boy been playing the role of father and mother both? Samuel cleared his throat softly. "Mind if I sit with you for a bit?" The children looked up at him, with eyes that reflected the pale moonlight streaming through the window. After a moment's hesitation, David nodded. Samuel settled himself on the floor beside Elizabeth's bed, his joints creaking in protest. "You know," Samuel said quietly, "I used to have nightmares too. After my wife died, I'd dream she was calling for help and I couldn't reach her." Elizabeth's sniffling slowed as she listened. "Dreams can feel more real than real life sometimes, can't they?" The little girl nodded against David's chest. "But here's what I learned. The scary things in dreams can't hurt us when we're awake. And when we're awake, we get to choose what happens next." Matthew spoke up for the first time that night, his voice small but curious. "What did you choose?" Samuel considered the question carefully. What had he chosen? For 2 years, he'd chosen loneliness, chosen to drift through days like a ghost haunting his own life. But sitting here with these children, he realized he'd made a different choice entirely. "I chose to try again," Samuel said simply, "to stop hiding from the world and start living in it." He looked at each child in turn. "And I chose you 3. That wasn't an accident or charity or feeling sorry for anybody. That was a choice I made because I saw something special in you." The next morning brought their first real test. Samuel was teaching the children how to tend his small vegetable garden when Helena Morrison's wagon rattled up the dirt path to his cabin. The children immediately tensed, David stepping protectively in front of his siblings while Matthew grabbed Elizabeth's hand. Samuel felt his own shoulders tighten as Helena climbed down from her wagon with the determined expression of a woman on a mission. "Morning, Samuel," Helena called out, but her eyes were fixed on the children. "Thought I'd bring some supplies for your new situation." She gestured to several bundles in the back of her wagon. "Clothes that might fit, some soap, a few other necessities." Samuel blinked in surprise. This wasn't the confrontation he'd been expecting. "That's very kind of you, Helena," Samuel managed, still trying to process this unexpected turn. Helena had been one of the most vocal critics of bringing those children into the community. Just yesterday, she'd made pointed comments about the dangers of harboring criminal blood. Now she was offering help. Helena's expression softened as she looked at Elizabeth, who was peeking out from behind David's legs. "Hello there, sweetheart," she said gently. "I brought you something special." From her basket, she produced a small rag doll with yellow yarn hair and a blue dress. Elizabeth's eyes went wide with wonder. It was the first toy anyone had given her in months. "Can I really have it?" Elizabeth whispered, looking back and forth between Helena and Samuel, like she expected someone to snatch the gift away. Helena knelt down to Elizabeth's level, her stern features transforming into something approaching grandmotherly warmth. "Of course you can, dear one. Every little girl needs a doll to keep her company." As Elizabeth carefully accepted the gift, Helena glanced up at Samuel with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I may have been hasty in my judgment," she said quietly. "Watching you with these children yesterday at the general store, seeing how gentle you are with them, well, it reminded me that actions matter more than bloodlines." But Helena's visit was only the beginning. As word spread through Millbrook that the Chamberlain children were living openly in Samuel's cabin, reactions varied wildly. Some townspeople, like Helena, chose compassion over fear. Others, however, viewed the children's presence as a threat to their peaceful community. The real trouble started at the schoolhouse. Samuel had spent the morning convincing David that education was important, that hiding from the world wouldn't solve anything. "You're smart as a whip," Samuel had argued, "and Matthew and Elizabeth deserved to learn their letters and numbers just like any other children." Reluctantly, David had agreed to give it a try. Miss Clara Hoffman, the young teacher, welcomed the children warmly enough. But during the lunch break, when the children were playing in the schoolyard, trouble arrived in the form of Jake Morrison, Helena's nephew, a boy of 14, with more muscles than sense and a chip on his shoulder the size of a railroad tie. "Well, well," Jake sneered, approaching David and Matthew where they sat sharing the simple lunch Samuel had packed. "Look what crawled out from under a rock. Chamberlain spawn, eating with decent folks' children." Several other boys gathered behind Jake, emboldened by his cruel confidence. David stood slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We're not looking for trouble," he said quietly. But Jake laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the playground like breaking glass. "Trouble? Boy, you are trouble. Your daddy was a killer and a thief, and everyone knows bad blood runs in families." Jake shoved David hard enough to send him stumbling backward. "Maybe we should run you out of town before you start following in his footsteps." The fight that followed was swift and brutal. David might have been smaller than Jake, but he'd learned to survive on the streets after his father's death, and desperation made him fierce. The two boys rolled in the dirt, trading punches while the other children formed a circle around them, some cheering, others crying for the teacher. When Miss Hoffman finally broke up the fight, both boys were bloody and breathing hard. Jake's nose was crooked and streaming red, while David had a split lip and the beginning of what would become a spectacular black eye. But it was the look in David's eyes that worried Samuel most when he arrived to collect the children, not pain or fear, but a cold anger that reminded him uncomfortably of the newspaper descriptions of Marcus Chamberlain. "Fighting won't solve anything," Samuel said gently, as he cleaned David's wounds that evening. The boy sat stiffly on the kitchen chair, jaw clenched against both physical pain and emotional turmoil. "He said we were bad," David replied through gritted teeth. "Said we'd turn out just like our father. Maybe he's right." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Samuel felt his heart break a little more. How many times had this boy heard such things? How many people had looked at him and seen only the shadow of his father's crimes? "People say a lot of things when they're scared," Samuel said carefully, "but saying something doesn't make it true. You are not your father, David. None of you are. You get to choose who you become." David looked up at him with eyes older than his years, eyes that had seen too much and carried too heavy a burden. "What if I can't choose?" David whispered. "What if the anger inside me is too big? Sometimes I feel it burning, wanting to hurt people who hurt us. What if that makes me just like him?" The question revealed the deepest fear Samuel had sensed in the boy from the beginning, not that others would reject him, but that he might truly deserve rejection. Samuel knelt beside David's chair, meeting the boy's gaze directly. "Feeling angry doesn't make you bad, son. It makes you human. What matters is what you do with that anger. Your father let it control him, let it turn him into something he wasn't meant to be. But you're already different. You protect your brother and sister. You work hard. You try to do right even when people treat you wrong. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." That night, as Samuel sat by his fireplace while the children slept, he found himself thinking about choices and consequences, about the weight of the past and the possibility of redemption. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows and sent leaves dancing across his porch like small ghosts. Winter was coming, and with it, new challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But for now, in this moment, his house was warm and full of the quiet breathing of children who felt safe enough to sleep deeply. For now, that was enough. The sound of horses approaching at dawn meant nothing good in Samuel's experience, and this morning proved no exception. He was splitting, kindling behind the cabin, when the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats made him freeze, axe, halfway through a piece of oak. Through the early morning mist, 3 riders emerged like specters from a bad dream. Sheriff William Durant flanked by 2 men Samuel didn't recognize, their brass badges catching the pale sunlight. "Samuel Hartwell?" Sheriff Durant called out, his voice carrying both authority and something that might have been regret. "We need to have ourselves a conversation." Samuel set down his axe with deliberate care, buying time to think while his heart hammered against his ribs. Behind him, he could hear the children stirring in the cabin, David's voice murmuring something to his siblings, probably telling them to stay quiet, stay hidden. The 2 strangers dismounted with the confident movements of men accustomed to having others step aside. Federal marshals, Samuel realized, noting their bearing and the official papers one of them carried. The older marshal, a man with silver hair and cold gray eyes, spoke first. "Name's Marshal Fitzpatrick. Here's Marshal Wade. We've come about the Chamberlain children." Samuel's mouth went dry, but he kept his voice steady. "What about them?" Marshal Fitzpatrick unfolded a document with practiced efficiency, the paper crackling in the morning air like a flag before battle. "There's been considerable interest in those children from various parties," the marshal said, his tone suggesting he was discussing livestock rather than human beings. "Questions about what they might know, where certain items might have been hidden. The territorial government believes they'd be better served in a more controlled environment." Sheriff Durant shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Samuel, you know I've got nothing but respect for you. We served together, bled together, but harboring the children of Marcus Chamberlain, well, it's got people asking questions I can't easily answer." The words stung because Samuel could hear the genuine conflict in his old friend's voice, duty warring with loyalty, law struggling against conscience. "What kind of questions?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew. The same questions that had been whispered in the general store, muttered at church, discussed in hushed tones whenever decent folks gathered. Were the children dangerous? Did they know where their father had hidden stolen money? Could they be trusted not to follow in his criminal footsteps? Marshal Wade, younger than his partner but twice as arrogant, stepped forward with the swagger of a man who'd never been told no. "The kind that require official answers," he said curtly. "These children are coming with us. There's a federal facility in Topeka where they can be properly supervised while we sort this mess out." The word facility sent ice through Samuel's veins. He'd heard stories about such places, institutions, where unwanted children disappeared into systems designed more for punishment than protection. Places where young souls were broken down and rebuilt according to someone else's vision of what they should become. "They're just children," Samuel said, his voice stronger now despite the fear clawing at his throat. "They haven't done anything wrong. David, Matthew, and Elizabeth are good kids who've already lost everything once. You can't." "We can, and we will," Marshal Fitzpatrick interrupted. "This isn't a request, Mr. Hartwell. It's a lawful order." He gestured toward the cabin where Samuel could see small faces pressed against the window. "Bring them out, now." That's when Samuel heard the soft sound of the cabin door opening, followed by bare feet on wooden planks. The children appeared on the porch like actors reluctantly taking the stage, David in front with Matthew and Elizabeth pressed close behind him. David's face was pale but determined, his green eyes fixed on the marshals with a steadiness that made Samuel's chest tight with pride and terror. "We'll come," David said quietly, his young voice carrying across the yard with heartbreaking dignity. "But we want to know where you're taking us, and for how long." The simple request for information, for basic human courtesy, seemed to surprise Marshal Wade, who had clearly expected tears and pleading. "That's not your concern, boy," Wade snapped. "Your job is to do what you're told and be grateful the government's willing to provide for you at all." The dismissive cruelty in his tone made Elizabeth whimper and step closer to Matthew, who wrapped his thin arms around his sister protectively. Samuel saw red. Not the gentle red of sunset or autumn leaves, but the blazing crimson of absolute fury. "Don't talk to them like that," he said, stepping between the marshals and the children. "These are human beings, not cattle to be herded around at your convenience." Marshal Fitzpatrick's hand moved to rest on his gun, not quite a threat, but close enough to send the message clearly. "Stand aside, Mr. Hartwell. We have our orders, and we will carry them out with or without your cooperation." The marshal's voice was calm, professional, the tone of a man who delivered similar ultimatums countless times before. But before anyone could move, another voice cut through the tension like a bell ringing across still water. "What exactly is going on here?" Helena Morrison had arrived without anyone noticing, her wagon loaded with what looked like supplies for Samuel's household. She climbed down with the determined grace of a woman who'd made up her mind about something important. "Mrs. Morrison," Sheriff Durant said, tipping his hat with obvious relief at having another adult present. "These federal marshals have come to collect the Chamberlain children. Official business." Helena's eyebrows rose as she took in the scene: 3 armed men facing down 1 unarmed farmer and 3 frightened children. "Official business?" she repeated, her tone suggesting she found the phrase distasteful. "And what crime have these children committed that requires such official attention?" The question hung in the morning air like a challenge, and Samuel saw something shift in Marshal Wade's expression. "It's not about crimes," Wade said impatiently. "It's about security, about making sure these children are properly supervised." And he stopped talking because Helena was laughing, not with humor, but with the kind of bitter amusement that came from hearing something truly absurd. "Properly supervised," Helena said, shaking her head. "By whom? Some government clerk who's never raised a child in his life? Some institution that treats human beings like problems to be solved?" She gestured towards Samuel and the children with one weathered hand. "I've been watching this family for weeks now. I've seen how these children help their neighbors, how they work in the garden, how they play with other kids without causing a lick of trouble. If that's not proper supervision, then I don't know what is." More voices joined the conversation as other townspeople began arriving, drawn by the commotion, or perhaps by some invisible signal that important events were unfolding. James the blacksmith appeared first, his massive arms crossed over his chest as he took in the standoff. Then came Martha from the general store, followed by the Reverend Collins. Then families Samuel barely knew but who had apparently been watching his little household with more interest than he'd realized. "What's all this about?" James asked, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. When Sheriff Durant explained the situation, the blacksmith's expression darkened. "So let me understand this correctly," James said slowly. "You want to take 3 innocent children away from a good home because of something their dead father did?" "It's more complicated than that," Marshal Fitzpatrick began, but Reverend Collins interrupted with the quiet authority that came from decades of comforting the afflicted and speaking truth to power. "No," the Reverend said simply. "It's exactly that simple. These children have found safety and love in Samuel's home. To tear them away from that because of fear and prejudice would be an act of cruelty that shames us all." The old man's words carried weight that went beyond his small stature, and Samuel saw several people nod in agreement. The crowd continued to grow as news of the confrontation spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Soon, nearly half the town had gathered in Samuel's yard, their voices rising in a chorus of support that surprised perhaps most of all the children themselves, who watched with wide eyes as their neighbors chose to stand with them rather than against them. "This is highly irregular," Marshal Wade protested, clearly unprepared for organized resistance. "We have our orders." But his words were drowned out by the sound of more wagons arriving, more voices joining the growing chorus of dissent. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who lived near the school, spoke up with the wavering voice of someone who'd lived through enough hardship to recognize unnecessary cruelty when she saw it. "These children helped me carry my groceries just yesterday," she said. "Sweet as pie, all 3 of them, and more polite than most adults I know. If you take them away, you'll be breaking up a family that's just started to heal." Samuel felt something shift in the air around them, not just the physical presence of supporters, but something deeper, more fundamental. For the first time since bringing the children home, he allowed himself to hope that love might prove stronger than fear, that community might triumph over bureaucracy. But as the marshals exchanged glances and began to look decidedly uncomfortable with the situation, Samuel knew this was far from over. Men with badges and orders didn't give up easily, and the children were still in danger of being torn away from everything they'd begun to call home. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the yard where two very different visions of justice faced each other down. One represented order, control, the belief that some problems could only be solved through official intervention. The other represented something messier but more human, the idea that families could be chosen, that communities could heal their own wounds, that sometimes the best supervision came not from institutions, but from neighbors who cared enough to pay attention. Which vision would prevail remained to be seen. But Samuel knew one thing for certain. He would not let these children go without a fight. Elizabeth's scream shattered the tense morning air as a gunshot echoed across Samuel's property, sending birds exploding from nearby trees in a panic of wings and cries. The little girl had been standing too close to Marshal Wade when his horse spooked at a sudden noise, and his pistol discharged accidentally into the ground, missing her by mere inches. The smell of gunpowder mixed with autumn dust as Elizabeth collapsed to her knees, sobbing with terror that reached into every adult's heart like a knife. "You fool!" Samuel roared, lunging toward the marshal with fury blazing in his eyes. "She's just a baby." But James the blacksmith was faster, his massive hand seizing Wade's arms before the federal man could draw his weapon properly. The crowd of townspeople pressed closer, their earlier murmurs of support now rising to angry shouts that carried across the Kansas plains like thunder. David had Elizabeth in his arms before anyone else could react, his young face pale but determined as he carried his sister toward the cabin porch. "It's okay, Lizzie," he whispered, though his own hands shook with leftover fear. "Nobody's hurt. You're safe." Matthew hovered nearby, his freckled face tight with an anger that made him look older than his 8 years. Helena Morrison stepped forward with the commanding presence of a woman who'd buried a husband and raised children through hardship. "Marshal Wade," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a church bell, "if you cannot control your weapon around children, perhaps you should question whether you're fit to be responsible for their welfare." The words struck home, and Wade's face flushed red beneath his hat brim. "It was an accident," Wade protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The horse startled when he stopped talking, because Sheriff Durant was giving him a look that could have frozen water in July. Durant had children of his own, and the sight of a grown man nearly shooting a little girl had clearly shifted something fundamental in his thinking. "Maybe," Durant said slowly, his hand resting on his own gun now, "we need to think about this situation a bit more carefully." The words carried weight that went beyond their surface meaning, and Marshal Fitzpatrick's expression tightened as he recognized the shift in dynamics. What had started as a simple enforcement action was becoming something much more complicated. Reverend Collins moved through the crowd like a shepherd among his flock, his weathered hands reaching out to touch shoulders and offer comfort. When he reached Samuel's side, the old preacher's voice carried the quiet authority of decades spent counseling the troubled and guiding the lost. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "we might step back from this confrontation and consider what's truly best for these children." But even as the immediate crisis seemed to ease, Samuel noticed something that made his blood run cold. At the edge of his property, partially hidden behind a stand of oak trees, sat another Rydera man in a dark coat whose face was obscured by shadow. The stranger had been watching the entire confrontation without participating, and something about his stillness suggested he was more than just a curious observer. "Who's that?" Samuel asked quietly, nodding toward the trees. Sheriff Durant followed his gaze and frowned, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. The stranger seemed to sense their attention because he urged his horse forward, moving with the careful control of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. As the rider emerged from the shadows, Samuel got his first clear look at the man's face, weathered and scarred, with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He wore the clothes of a prosperous rancher, but something in his bearing suggested violence held carefully in check. When he spoke, his voice carried the hint of an accent Samuel couldn't quite place. "Afternoon, folks," the stranger said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that seemed more mocking than polite. Couldn't help but notice the commotion. "Name's Carlton Reeves." The name meant nothing to Samuel, but he saw Marshal Fitzpatrick's expression change her surprise mixed with something that looked like fear. "Mr. Reeves," Fitzpatrick said carefully, His earlier confidence noticeably diminished. "We weren't expecting you until—" Reeves held up one gloved hand, silencing the marshal with a gesture that spoke of accustomed authority. "Plans change," Reeves said simply, his pale eyes finding the children on the porch. "I take it these are the Chamberlain offspring." The way he said it clinical, detached made Samuel's skin crawl. This wasn't a man who saw children when he looked at David, Matthew, and Elizabeth. This was someone who saw property, or problems, or something else entirely. Helena Morrison stepped forward with the protective instincts of a woman who'd raised 4 children of her own. "And who might you be to be asking?" she demanded, her voice carrying the edge of a mother bear defending her cubs. Reeves smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in the Chamberlain family legacy," Reeves replied. "Their father left behind certain obligations that these children might help resolve." The words sent a chill through the assembled crowd, and Samuel felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Marcus Chamberlain hadn't just been a bank robber and killer, he'd been part of something bigger, something that had apparently survived his death. And now that larger something had come looking for his children, probably hoping they knew secrets that had died with their father. Samuel's mind raced as he considered the implications. If Reeves represented criminal interests, then the federal marshals might actually be the lesser of 2 evils. "The children don't know anything," Samuel said firmly, stepping between Reeves and the cabin. "They were abandoned at an orphanage. They've been through enough." Reeves chuckled, a sound like grinding glass. "Oh, I'm sure they know more than they realize," he said, dismounting with fluid grace. "Children see things, hear things, remember things that adults think they've forgotten. My associates and I would very much like to have a conversation with them." The threat was barely veiled, and Samuel felt the crowd behind him shift restlessly. James the blacksmith moved to Samuel's left side, while Helena took position on his right. And suddenly the confrontation had 3 sides instead of 2. The federal marshals wanted to take the children for official reasons. Carlton Reeves wanted them for unofficial ones. And the people of Millbrook wanted to protect them from both threats. "Now, hold on just a minute," Sheriff Durant said, his voice rising above the murmur of voices. "I don't know who you are, mister, but you're talking about questioning children, and that's not something I can allow without proper legal authority." Reeves turned his pale gaze on the sheriff, and Samuel saw Durant's hand move closer to his gun. "Sheriff Durant, isn't it?" Reeves said conversationally. "I understand you lost a deputy last year, shot down during a bank robbery in Lawrence." Durant's face went white, then red with fury. The deputy had been young, barely 20, with a wife and infant son. His death had hit the entire community hard. "What's that got to do with anything?" Durant demanded. But Samuel could see the terrible understanding dawning in the sheriff's eyes. Reeves smiled again, that cold expression that made autumn winds seem warm by comparison. "Marcus Chamberlain pulled that trigger," Reeves said simply. "And his children might know where he hid the money from that job. Money that could compensate the deputy's widow, help her raise that boy without his father." The words hit their target perfectly, and Samuel watched Durant struggle with competing loyalties. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the yard, where too many people with too many different agendas faced off over the fate of 3 children who had never asked for any of this attention. Samuel could feel the situation spiraling beyond anyone's control, pulled in directions that would tear his small family apart, no matter who won. But then Elizabeth spoke up from the porch, her small voice carrying clearly in the tense air. "We don't know about any money," she said, her words simple and honest in a way that cut through all the adult complications. "Papa was gone a lot, and when he came home he was sad and angry. We just wanted him to be happy again." The innocent truth of her statement seemed to deflate some of the tension, reminding everyone present that they were discussing the fate of real children with real feelings, not abstract problems to be solved through force or law. Samuel saw several faces in the crowd soften, and even Marshal Fitzpatrick looked uncomfortable with the direction things had taken. Reeves, however, seemed unmoved by the little girl's words. "Children often know more than they think they do," he repeated, stepping closer to the porch. "Sometimes a friendly conversation can help them remember important details." The way he said friendly made it clear he had other methods in mind if conversation failed. That's when David surprised everyone by standing up and walking to the edge of the porch, his young face set with determination that reminded Samuel powerfully of his late father, not the criminal Marcus Chamberlain, but the broken soldier who tried to send money to his victims' families. "If you want to talk to us," David said clearly, "then do it here in front of everyone. We've got nothing to hide." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun, and Samuel felt a surge of pride in the boy's courage even as he feared what Reeves might do in response. The standoff had reached a turning point, but which way it would tip remained anyone's guess. The schoolhouse bell clanged frantically in the distance as news of the confrontation spread through Millbrook like wildfire, bringing more townspeople rushing toward Samuel's property with each passing minute. By noon, nearly the entire population of the small Kansas community had gathered in his yard, turning what had started as a simple law enforcement action into something resembling a town meeting, albeit one with guns and federal marshals. Carlton Reeves stood apart from the crowd, his pale eyes moving constantly as he assessed the situation with the calculating gaze of a predator. Samuel noticed how the man's right hand never strayed far from his coat, where the outline of a concealed weapon was barely visible. This wasn't someone accustomed to having his plans disrupted by ordinary citizens, and his growing irritation was becoming dangerous. "This has gone on long enough," Reeves announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. "I came here for a simple business transaction, not a circus." He gestured dismissively at the crowd of townspeople. "These people have no legal standing in this matter. The children are coming with me." "Like hell they are," James the blacksmith rumbled, his massive frame blocking Reeves's path to the cabin. "You haven't shown any badge, any papers, any authority at all. For all we know, you're just another outlaw looking to hurt innocent kids." The accusation struck home, and Samuel saw Reeves's mask of civilized politeness slip slightly. "I don't need papers," Reeves replied coldly. "I have something better necessity. Marcus Chamberlain stole from my employer, and his children represent the only remaining link to recovering that property." The admission sent a ripple of understanding through the crowd. Reeves wasn't working for the government, was a hired gun, probably working for whoever had been robbed by the children's father. Marshal Fitzpatrick looked increasingly uncomfortable as the situation spiraled beyond his control. "Mr. Reeves," he said carefully, "perhaps we should coordinate our efforts through official channels. The territorial government has procedures for—" Reeves silenced him with a look that could have frozen blood. "Your procedures have failed," Reeves said flatly. "It's been 3 years since Chamberlain's death, and you've recovered nothing. My employer's patience is exhausted." He turned his attention back to the children on the porch, his voice taking on a deceptively gentle tone. "David, isn't it? You're the oldest. Surely you remember your father talking about his work, mentioning places he'd been or things he'd hidden." David's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "My father didn't talk about his work around us," the boy said clearly. "He tried to keep that part of his life separate from our family." The answer seemed to frustrate Reeves, whose friendly facade was wearing thinner by the minute. "Children often overhear things," Reeves pressed. "A name, a location, something that seemed unimportant at the time, but might make sense now." He took another step toward the porch, and Samuel moved to intercept him, only to find Sheriff Durant blocking his path. "Easy, Samuel," Durant said quietly. "Let the man ask his questions. If the children really don't know anything, this will be over soon enough." But Samuel could see the conflict in his old friend's eyes, duty warring with decency, law struggling against conscience. Elizabeth had been listening to the adult conversation with the wide-eyed attention of a child trying to understand something beyond her years. Suddenly, she tugged on David's sleeve and whispered something in his ear. David's expression changed, not fear, but confusion mixed with something that might have been recognition. "What is it, Lizzie?" Matthew asked, crouching beside his sister. Elizabeth looked around at all the adult faces watching her, then back at her brothers. Whatever she was thinking clearly frightened her, but she seemed to be wrestling with whether to speak. "It's probably nothing," she said in her small voice. "But that man," she pointed at Reeves. "He talks like the scary man who came to our house before Papa died, the one who made Mama cry." The words hit the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt, and Samuel saw understanding dawn on several faces. Reeves had gone very still, his pale eyes fixed on Elizabeth with an intensity that made Samuel's skin crawl. "What scary man?" David asked gently, kneeling beside his sister. Can you remember what he looked like? Elizabeth's small face scrunched up with concentration. He had light eyes like winter sky, and a voice that sounded like broken glass. He told Papa that time was running out, that debts had to be paid. She looked directly at Reeves. You sound just like him. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire, and Samuel saw the last pretense of civility drain from Reeves's expression. The man's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, but James the blacksmith was faster, his massive fist connecting with Reeves's jaw before the gun could clear its holster. The fight that followed was brief but vicious. Reeves might have been skilled, but he was vastly outnumbered, and the townspeople had no patience for anyone who threatened their children, even children who weren't technically theirs. When the dust settled, Reeves was on the ground with James's boot on his chest and his weapon in Sheriff Durant's hand. Well, Durant said, examining the gun with professional interest, this changes things considerably. He looked up at Marshal Fitzpatrick with an expression that suggested the federal man had some explaining to do. You wouldn't happen to know why your business associate here is carrying a weapon with the serial numbers filed off, would you? Marshal Fitzpatrick's face had gone gray. He's not our associate, he said quickly. We've never seen him before today. But his nervous glance toward Marshal Wade suggested otherwise, and Samuel began to understand the full scope of what they'd stumbled into. Federal marshals working with hired guns, Helena Morrison said with disgust. Is this what passes for law enforcement these days? She turned to address the crowd with the authority of a woman who'd helped build this community from nothing. I say we handle this ourselves. These children have found a good home with Samuel, and that's where they're staying. The murmur of agreement that rose from the assembled townspeople was like music to Samuel's ears, but he knew their troubles were far from over. Even with Reeves temporarily neutralized, there would be questions, investigations, probably more federal involvement. The children's past would continue to follow them like a shadow. But then Reverend Collins stepped forward with the quiet dignity that had made him a pillar of the community for 30 years. I've been thinking about something, the old preacher said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. About names and inheritance, about what children owe to their parents' choices. He walked slowly toward the porch where the children waited, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. David, Matthew, Elizabeth, he said gently, would you like to hear what I think? The children nodded, drawn by the kindness in his voice. I think, Reverend Collins continued, that God doesn't judge children for their parents' sins. I think every person gets to choose who they want to be, regardless of the name they were born with. He paused, looking around at the assembled crowd. And I think this community has already chosen who these children are. They're our children now. Our responsibility. Our family. The words seemed to settle something in the air around them, transforming the confrontation into something approaching a celebration. People began to step forward, offering help, support, whatever the children might need. Mrs. Patterson volunteered to help with tutoring. The baker's wife offered to teach Elizabeth how to make cookies. James the blacksmith suggested that David might like to learn some practical skills around the forge. Samuel felt tears sting his eyes as he watched his neighbor's people he'd known for years but never truly appreciated really around 3 children who had started the day as strangers and outcasts. The transformation was miraculous, but it was also fragile. Laws and official orders still had power, and men like Reeves had employers who wouldn't give up easily. But for this moment, in this place, love had proven stronger than fear, and community had triumphed over bureaucracy. Samuel gathered the children close as the crowd began to disperse, many people promising to return later with food, clothes, or simply friendship. Are we really staying? Elizabeth asked, her voice muffled against Samuel's shirt. For always? Samuel looked down at her upturned face, then at David and Matthew, and saw his own future reflected in their eyes, not the lonely, empty existence he'd been drifting through, but something richer and more challenging and infinitely more worthwhile. For always, he promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family. The telegram arrived 3 weeks later while Samuel was teaching David how to mend fence posts, its yellow paper crackling like autumn leaves in the October wind. Elizabeth ran from the house clutching the message, her face bright with excitement, until she saw the serious expressions of the adults reading over Samuel's shoulder. The words were simple but chilling. Federal investigation concluded. Children cleared of wrongdoing. However, private interests remain active. Suggest relocation. Durant. What does it mean? David asked, setting down his hammer as he watched Samuel's face grow pale. Matthew appeared from the garden where he'd been harvesting the last of the season's vegetables, dirt still clinging to his hands and knees. The boy had grown 2 inches since arriving at the cabin, his freckled face filling out with regular meals and genuine laughter. Samuel folded the telegram carefully, buying time while his mind raced through possibilities. The official investigation clearing the children was good news, but Sheriff Durant's warning about private interests meant Carlton Reeves' employers hadn't given up. Somewhere out there, powerful people still believed these children held the key to recovering stolen money, and such people rarely accepted defeat gracefully. It means we need to be extra careful for a while, Samuel said finally, trying to keep his voice calm despite the fear gnawing at his stomach. Some folks still think you might know things about your father's activities, even though we've told them you don't. Elizabeth's bottom lip trembled as she processed this information, and Matthew moved protectively closer to his sister. But we told the truth, Matthew said, his young voice carrying a note of frustration that Samuel recognized all too well. We don't know anything about money or hiding places or any of that stuff. Why won't they believe us? The question struck at the heart of something Samuel had been struggling to understand himself. How could adults be so determined to punish children for crimes they'd never committed? The answer came from an unexpected source. Helena Morrison's wagon rattled up the path just as the first drops of rain began to fall, her usually neat appearance disheveled and her face grim with news that couldn't wait for social pleasantries. She climbed down from her seat with the urgency of someone carrying important information. "Samuel," she called out, not bothering with her usual greetings. "We need to talk, all of us." She gestured toward the children with a gravity that made Samuel's chest tighten. There are things these young ones need to know, things that might help them understand why they're still being hunted. Inside the cabin, with rain drumming against the windows and the children gathered around the kitchen table, Helena shared what she'd learned from her correspondence with relatives in other parts of Kansas. The picture she painted was darker and more complex than any of them had imagined. "Your father wasn't just a bank robber," Helena said gently, addressing the children directly. "He was part of a larger organization who'd fought in the war and couldn't find their way back to peaceful living. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Lost, and they had members in 6 different states." She paused, watching the children's faces as they absorbed this information. David's green eyes were thoughtful as he processed what Helena was telling them. "So Papa wasn't alone," he said quietly. "There were others like him." It wasn't a question, and Helena nodded sadly. Many others. Men who'd seen too much killing, lost too much in the war, couldn't settle back into normal life. They convinced themselves they were still fighting for something, but really they were just lost. Helena's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen the war's aftermath destroy too many good men. "But here's what you need to understand," she continued, leaning forward with urgent intensity. "The Brotherhood had rules, codes, ways of hiding money that only members knew. When your father died, he took those secrets with Jaime, except other members think he might have shared them with his family before the end." The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. These children weren't being hunted because of what they knew, but because of what others believed they might know. The difference was crucial. It meant no amount of protesting their innocence would make the threat go away. "So what do we do?" Samuel asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Helena's expression confirmed his worst suspicions. "The territorial marshal sent word through unofficial channels," she said quietly. "He suggests you might want to consider starting fresh somewhere else." Somewhere the Chamberlain name doesn't carry so much weight. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Samuel felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. "Leave?" Elizabeth asked in a small voice. "But this is our home now. We have friends here and school and—" She trailed off as the reality of their situation sank in. They'd found safety and belonging in Millbrook, but that safety was an illusion if dangerous men could still track them down. "Where would we go?" David asked, his young voice carrying the weight of premature responsibility. "And how do we know they wouldn't follow us wherever we went?" The questions revealed the sharp intelligence that reminded Samuel so powerfully of the boy's father, not the criminal Marcus Chamberlain. but the thoughtful young man who'd written letters to his victims' families. Samuel stood and walked to the window, watching rain cascade down the glass like tears on a mourner's face. Outside, the world looked gray and uncertain, matching his own mood perfectly. For 3 weeks, he'd allowed himself to believe they'd won, that love and community had triumphed over fear and prejudice. Now he realized they'd only won a battle in a much larger war. "Maybe," he said slowly, turning back to face his family, "we don't run." The words surprised him even as he spoke them, but once voiced, they felt right, in a way that fleeing never could. "Maybe we stay and fight for what we've built here." Helena's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Samuel, these aren't playground bullies we're talking about. These are dangerous men with resources and connections. They won't give up just because we ask them nicely." But Samuel shook his head, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "What if we give them what they want?" he asked, watching the children's faces carefully. "Not information we don't have, any but proof that there's nothing to find. What if we could convince them once and for all that chasing these children is a waste of time?" David leaned forward with interest. "How would we do that?" Samuel looked at each child in turn, seeing not victims but survivors, not problems but solutions. "By telling your father's real story," Samuel said simply. "Not the version in the newspapers or the tales other criminals tell, but the truth about who Marcus Chamberlain really was and why he did what he did." The suggestion seemed to galvanize something in the children, and Samuel saw hope replace fear in their young faces. "Would people believe us?" Matthew asked, his freckled face serious with concentration. "Would they listen to what we have to say?" Samuel nodded, his conviction growing stronger with each passing moment. "They'll listen," he said firmly, "because we're going to give them a story worth hearing. Not just about crime and punishment, but about redemption and second chances, and the power of choosing who you want to become." He looked around at his small family. These 3 children who'd taught him more about courage and love than he'd ever learned in his adult life. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the dust from the world and preparing the earth for whatever seeds might be planted in the coming spring. Inside the warm cabin, 4 people who'd found each other against all odds began planning how to fight for their right to stay together, to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The war for their future was far from over, but Samuel no longer feared the outcome. They had something their enemies lacked: the truth and the courage to tell it. The courtroom in Topeka buzzed with anticipation as reporters from newspapers across Kansas territory filled the gallery, their pencils poised to capture every word of what promised to be the most unusual hearing in recent memory. Samuel straightened his best shirt and glanced down at the children beside him, their faces pale but determined as they prepared to tell their father's story to a room full of strangers who would decide their fate. Judge Harrison Blackwood, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his impatience with legal theatrics, rapped his gavel sharply to bring the crowded room to order. "This hearing," he announced in a voice that carried to the back rows, "will determine whether David, Matthew, and Elizabeth Chamberlain pose any continuing threat to public safety and whether they possess information relevant to ongoing criminal investigations." The past month had been a whirlwind of preparation, legal consultations, and mounting tension as Samuel worked with a young lawyer named Thomas Kent to build their case. Kent was fresh out of law school but possessed a passionate belief in justice that reminded Samuel of his younger self. More importantly, he'd listened to the children's story with genuine compassion rather than calculated strategy. "Your Honor," Kent began, rising with the nervous energy of someone making his first major argument, "these children have been pursued, threatened, and traumatized not because of anything they've done, but because of what others imagine they might know. Today, we intend to prove that their father's final actions were those of a man seeking redemption, not a criminal planning future crimes." Carlton Reeves sat in the gallery with 2 other men Samuel didn't recognize, their expensive clothes and cold expressions marking them as representatives of whoever had hired Reeves to recover the stolen money. Their presence was a constant reminder that legal victory might not end the children's troubles, but Samuel had come to believe that truth was their only weapon against such enemies. David was called to testify first, his small figure dwarfed by the witness stand but his voice steady as he swore to tell the truth. Under Kent's gentle questioning, the boy painted a picture of Marcus Chamberlain that differed sharply from newspaper accounts of father, who came home from his crimes exhausted and ashamed, who spoke often of finding a way to make amends for his actions. He used to sit by my bed at night when he thought I was sleeping, David said, his green eyes fixed on some distant memory. He'd tell me he was sorry, that he'd lost his way but was trying to find it again. He said the war had broken something inside him, and he didn't know how to fix it except by providing for us the only way he knew how. The prosecutor, a stern man named Williams, who clearly viewed this hearing as an unnecessary waste of time, attempted to discredit David's testimony. Children often misunderstand adult conversations, he suggested. How can we trust the interpretation of events by someone who was barely 7 years old? But David's response surprised everyone in the courtroom. I understood enough to know my father was in pain, the boy said quietly. I understood enough to see him cry when he thought nobody was watching. Children see more than adults think we do, especially when the adults we love are hurting. Matthew's testimony focused on the months before their father's death, when Marcus Chamberlain had begun talking about making things right and finding a different path. The 8-year-old boy's account was simpler than his brother's, but no less powerful, describing a father who'd started reading his children bedtime stories about heroes who overcame their mistakes through courage and sacrifice. Elizabeth, despite being the youngest, provided the most compelling testimony of all. When Kent asked her to describe her last conversation with her father, her small voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. Papa told me he was going away for a while, but he wanted me to remember that being good was more important than being rich or famous or scary. He said even when grown-ups make bad choices, they can still choose to do better. The emotional impact of the children's testimony was visible throughout the courtroom. Several reporters had stopped taking notes to wipe their eyes, and even Judge Blackwood seemed moved by the simple honesty of their words. But the real surprise came when Prosecutor Williams called his key witness, a man Samuel, recognized with a shock as Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison, Helena's older brother who'd been investigating the Brotherhood of the Lost for 2 years. Marshal Morrison, Williams began, in your investigation of the criminal organization known as the Brotherhood of the Lost, did you uncover evidence regarding Marcus Chamberlain's final activities? Morrison stood tall in his federal uniform, his weathered face serious as he consulted his notes. I did, Morrison replied. 3 months before his death, Marcus Chamberlain contacted federal authorities through an intermediary, offering to provide information about Brotherhood operations in exchange for protection for his family. The revelation sent a murmur through the courtroom, and Samuel felt his heart begin to race. Did he provide such information? Williams asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Morrison nodded gravely. He did. Marcus Chamberlain's information led to the arrest of 7 Brotherhood members across 3 states, effectively breaking the organization's power structure. He also provided detailed accounts of hidden money caches, allowing us to recover nearly 80% of stolen funds for return to victims. The marshal's words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt, transforming the entire narrative of Marcus Chamberlain's life and death. Kent leaped to his feet. Your Honor, this information completely changes our understanding of Mr. Chamberlain's motives and actions. If he was cooperating with federal authorities, then the money his children are supposedly hiding never existed. It was already recovered through his cooperation. Judge Blackwood's expression showed he was reaching the same conclusion. But Morrison wasn't finished. There's more, he said, his voice carrying across the now silent courtroom. Marcus Chamberlain didn't just provide information. He insisted that any recovered funds first go to compensate his victims' families before anything was returned to banks or businesses. He specifically requested that his children never be told about his cooperation, fearing it would make them targets for Brotherhood revenge. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Marcus Chamberlain had spent his final months not planning new crimes but working to undo the damage of his past. His cooperation with federal authorities had made him a marked man, explaining why he'd been killed not by lawmen but by his former criminal associates. And his insistence on anonymity had inadvertently left his children vulnerable to exactly the kind of pursuit they'd been experiencing. Carlton Reeves and his companions left the courtroom before Morrison finished testifying, their expressions grim with the knowledge that their long pursuit had been pointless from the beginning. There was no hidden money because Marcus Chamberlain had already helped authorities recover it. There were no secret codes because he'd shared everything he knew with federal investigators. There were no family secrets because a dying man had chosen redemption over loyalty to his criminal past. Judge Blackwood's ruling was swift and decisive. These children pose no threat to public safety and possess no information relevant to criminal investigations. Furthermore, they are to be commended for their courage in sharing their father's story, helping us understand that even those who lose their way can find redemption through service to others. He looked directly at Samuel and the children. This family has my blessing to build their future wherever they choose, free from harassment or persecution. The journey home to Millbrook felt different than any trip Samuel had taken before. The children chattered excitedly about their friends, their school, their plans for the garden next spring. They'd left for Topeka as fugitives carrying the burden of their father's crimes. They were returning as free citizens with a story of redemption that would be told for generations. As their wagon crested the hill overlooking Millbrook, Samuel saw the entire town waiting in the street below, banners hanging between buildings, people crowding the boardwalks, children running alongside the wagon as it made its way toward home. Helena Morrison stood on the porch of her general store, tears streaming down her face as she waved a welcome that spoke of community, acceptance, and love. That evening, as Samuel tucked the children into their beds that now belonged to them permanently, in a house that would always be their home, Elizabeth asked the question that had been on all their minds. "Do you think Papa would be proud of us?" she whispered in the darkness. Samuel considered the question carefully, thinking of a man who'd lost his way after war but found it again through love for his children. "I think," he said softly, "that your father's greatest victory wasn't any bank he robbed or crime he committed. It was raising 3 children brave enough to tell the truth when the world needed to hear it." Outside, autumn wind whispered through the Kansas grassland, carrying the scent of coming rain and the promise of spring planting. Inside the warm cabin, 4 people who'd found each other against impossible odds settled into sleep, secure in the knowledge that they'd fought for their right to be a family and won. The Chamberlain name would still carry weight in Kansas territory, but now it would be remembered not just for crime and violence, but for courage, truth, and the radical idea that no child should be judged by their parents' mistakes. And in a small cabin outside Millbrook, 3 children would grow up knowing that families could be chosen, that redemption was always possible, and that love was stronger than fear when good people chose to stand together. Samuel's last thought before sleep was of Margaret, and how proud she would have been of the family he'd built from the ashes of loss. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to prove that second chances were worth fighting for. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be.